Georgia. A royal tribute hidden in the south. In the year 1732, a name crossed an ocean, Georgia. A royal tribute to King George II of Great Britain, bestowed on a land he would never touch. It was the final of the 13 colonies, carved into the map as both a gesture of loyalty and a bold frontier. Here, at the empire's edge, dreams of opportunity clashed with the harsh realities of survival. And it was here that a visionary would step forward, determined to shape this wild, unclaimed territory into something far greater. Georgia was more than just a name on a royal charter, it was a promise. A land where the salt air met fertile soil, where rivers carved lifelines through forests, and where a new start awaited those burdened by the weight of the old world. From Savannah's meticulously planned streets to the rolling hills inland, it shone like a jewel in the southern crown. But beauty alone would not define it. This was a place built with purpose, where every brick, every field, and every life carried the imprint of a grand design. One man's vision for a colony unlike any other. King George II's legacy. In the grand halls of London, far from the wild, untamed lands across the Atlantic, King George II reigned over an empire at its height. He was not the most celebrated monarch in British history, but his name would travel farther than most, etched forever into the map of a distant land. When the charter for Britain's 13th colony was signed in 1732, it was dedicated to him. The name, Georgia, was not chosen casually. It was a symbolic gesture of loyalty, an acknowledgement that this final slice of Britain's American holdings belonged, at least in name, to the king himself. King George II, born in 1683, was a ruler whose reign balanced both war and diplomacy. He oversaw Britain during a time of expanding global influence, and his colonial policies were as strategic as they were ambitious. Georgia's creation served a clear purpose: to secure Britain's southern frontier in North America. Nestled between the established colony of South Carolina and Spanish-held Florida, Georgia would stand as a buffer, a living shield against rival empires. But its founding also carried a humanitarian vision, one that would distinguish it from its neighbors. The king's endorsement of the new colony went beyond the ceremonial granting of a name. He approved the charter that granted unusual freedoms for the time: religious liberty for all Protestants, a ban on slavery in the early years, and a unique trust-based governance structure. These measures reflected not only the influence of the colony's founder, James Oglethorpe, but also the monarch's willingness to allow a different kind of settlement to emerge. While many colonies were driven primarily by profit, Georgia would be guided, at least in its infancy, by ideals. Still, the king's legacy here was not without complexity. Though the colony bore his name, he would never step foot on its soil, never walk the streets of Savannah, never see the marshes glisten in the southern sun. His connection to Georgia was a political and symbolic one, but it was strong enough to give the young settlement a certain prestige. To be under the king's favor meant protection, legitimacy, and the promise of resources in times of need. Yet this royal blessing also came with expectations. Georgia's settlers were to uphold British law, defend the territory against Spanish and French ambitions, and serve as an example of loyalty to the crown. In the early years, this connection to King George II was a source of pride, his name lending weight to their efforts, his authority shaping the very foundations of the colony's laws and governance. Over time, as Georgia's story unfolded, the king's name would take on new meanings. What began as a tribute to monarchy would evolve into a symbol of the state's enduring identity. Even after revolutions swept through the colonies and loyalty to the crown was severed, Georgia kept its name, carrying with it the memory of a time when a distant ruler's favor helped give it life. And at the heart of that life stood the man whose determination turned the royal charter into reality, the man whose vision would guide the colony from an idea into a living, thriving settlement. Oglethorpe's vision. James Oglethorpe was not a man content to sit in Parliament and watch the world move without him. In London, he had earned a reputation as a reformer, a man deeply troubled by the plight of England's debtors, crammed into overcrowded prisons, their lives wasted away over sums so small they could barely feed a family for a week. To Oglethorpe, these men and women were not criminals beyond redemption, they were victims of a broken system. And in the unclaimed lands of Britain's American frontier, he saw an opportunity for renewal. When King George II granted the charter for Georgia in 1732, Oglethorpe became its most determined champion. His vision was ambitious: to create a colony where the poor and the oppressed could start fresh, free from the crushing debts and injustices of the old world. He imagined a society built on hard work, fairness, and moral purpose, a stark contrast to the profit-driven plantations that dominated much of the South. From the beginning, Georgia was to be different. Oglethorpe and the trustees who governed the colony set forth rules that reflected his ideals. Slavery was banned. Land ownership was limited to prevent vast estates from forming and to encourage self-reliance. Rum and other hard liquors were prohibited, as were lawyers. Oglethorpe believed disputes should be settled by reason, not litigation. Above all, religious freedom was offered to all Protestants, opening the door for diverse communities to find a home here. In 1733, Oglethorpe led the first settlers across the Atlantic, landing at Yamacraw Bluff along the Savannah River. Here, with the cooperation of the Yamacraw chief Tomochichi, the foundations of Savannah were laid. Oglethorpe's city plan was unlike anything else in the colonies. A grid system of streets punctuated by public squares, each serving as a gathering place, a market, and a defense point if needed. These squares, shaded by oaks and lined with homes, reflected his belief that order, beauty, and community should be at the heart of daily life. He worked tirelessly, not just as a leader, but as a participant. Oglethorpe shared in the settlers' hardships, sleeping in the same rough shelters and laboring alongside them to clear land and build. He negotiated with neighboring Native American tribes, fostering alliances that ensured peace in the colony's fragile early years. His friendship with Tomochichi became one of the most enduring symbols of mutual respect between European settlers and native peoples in that era. But Oglethorpe's vision was more than humanitarian, it was strategic. He understood that Georgia was the southernmost outpost of Britain's American Empire, its first line of defense against Spanish Florida. To protect his fledgling colony, he strengthened ties with native allies, built fortifications along the coast, and prepared his settlers for the reality that this land was not just a place of hope, it was a place of risk. Still, Oglethorpe never lost sight of his ideals. He resisted the pressures to turn Georgia into another slaveholding plantation colony. He believed that hard-working free settlers, bound by shared responsibility, would be the strongest defense against any threat. To him, the colony's moral strength was inseparable from its survival. Yet ideals alone could not shield Georgia from danger. The Spanish in Florida had their eyes on Britain's new southern outpost, and tensions along the border simmered. The peace Oglethorpe had so carefully cultivated with native allies would soon be tested. And as whispers of war grew louder, the colony's purpose as a buffer would take center stage, because while Georgia was born from a vision of opportunity and justice, its survival would soon depend on how well it could stand as a shield. The Southern defense. From its first days, Georgia was more than just a settlement, it was a line drawn in the sand. For all of Oglethorpe's dreams of fairness and opportunity, the colony's existence carried a far more urgent purpose: defense. It was the southernmost of Britain's 13 colonies, planted directly between the wealthy, established plantations of South Carolina and the Spanish stronghold of Florida. To London's eyes, Georgia was not just a humanitarian project, it was a fortress in waiting. The Spanish, entrenched in St. Augustine, viewed Britain's new colony as a direct threat to their claims in the New World. To them, Georgia was an intrusion, a foothold that could one day tip the balance of power in Britain's favor. The tension between the two empires was not merely political, it was personal for those who lived on the frontier. Every settler in Georgia understood that war was not a distant possibility, it was a shadow hanging over their homes. Oglethorpe knew that survival meant preparation. He oversaw the construction of forts along Georgia's vulnerable coastline and southern border. Fort Frederica on St. Simon's Island became the crown jewel of these defenses. Built from the oyster shell cement known as tabby, it was both practical and formidable, a testament to the colony's dual purpose as a haven and a bulwark. But fortifications alone would not be enough. Oglethorpe forged alliances with the Creek and other native tribes, turning diplomatic trust into military advantage. These relationships were critical. The local tribes knew the terrain, the waterways, and the patterns of the Spanish forces. In return, Oglethorpe offered respect, trade, and mutual protection, a rare approach in an era when most colonial leaders saw indigenous people only as obstacles. By 1739, Britain and Spain were openly at war in the conflict known as the War of Jenkins' Ear. Georgia, still in its infancy, was thrust directly into the fray. Oglethorpe led bold expeditions into Florida, attempting to strike the Spanish before they could strike him. While not all his campaigns succeeded, his most famous victory came in 1742, at the Battle of Bloody Marsh on St. Simon's Island. Outnumbered but strategically cunning, Oglethorpe's forces repelled the Spanish advance, ensuring Georgia's survival and cementing its role as the southern shield of the British colonies. For the settlers, this victory was more than a military triumph. It was proof that the colony could hold its ground against the might of a European empire. Life after the battle returned to its familiar rhythm of farming, trade, and community building, but the memory of those tense days never faded. Georgia had proven its worth to the crown, not only as a settlement but as a guardian of Britain's southern frontier. Yet the very success of Georgia's defense brought change. Over time, many of Oglethorpe's strict laws, especially the ban on slavery, were overturned by new leaders who saw economic gain in the plantation system. The colony's identity began to shift, moving away from Oglethorpe's vision of a free, egalitarian society toward the agricultural model of its neighbors. The defensive purpose remained, but the moral experiment that had set Georgia apart began to fade. Still, the loyalty between Georgia and the British Crown ran deep in these years. The settlers had fought and bled under the Union Jack, defended the king's territory, and secured their place in the empire. But as the decades passed, the winds of political change began to stir in the colonies. Distant whispers of discontent with British rule grew louder, carried from Boston to Charleston, and even to the streets of Savannah. Georgia, the colony that had once stood as the king's proud southern stronghold, would soon face a question more dangerous than any Spanish cannon. When loyalty to the crown was tested, which side would it choose? Loyalty tested, for decades, Georgia had stood as one of Britain's most steadfast colonies. It had defended the empire's southern border, upheld the king's authority, and thrived under the security that royal protection brought. But by the mid-1770s, the political climate in the American colonies had begun to change in ways that no fort or treaty could defend against. The disputes that had once been distant murmurs from the northern colonies now echoed in Georgia's streets, forcing its people to face an uncomfortable truth. Loyalty to the crown was no longer unquestioned. The seeds of unrest had been planted by a series of British policies that touched every corner of colonial life. New taxes, enforced without colonial representation, stirred resentment even in Georgia, a place that had long benefited from royal favor. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and trade restrictions began to feel less like governance and more like control. While Georgia had prospered under Britain's watch, it was not immune to the growing belief that the colonies deserved a greater voice in their own affairs. Yet Georgia's position was complicated. It was the youngest of the 13 colonies, still heavily reliant on British military protection and trade. Many of its influential leaders, planters, merchants, and officials, feared that breaking from the crown would jeopardize the stability they had worked so hard to secure. This cautious loyalty made Georgia slower than other colonies to embrace the revolutionary cause. In 1775, when delegates from across America met in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress, Georgia was the only colony that did not send representatives. But events soon forced the issue. Revolutionary sentiment was rising among ordinary Georgians, especially in coastal towns like Savannah. Patriot groups began to form, challenging the authority of the royal governor, James Wright. In January 1776, Georgia's first major act of defiance came when a group of patriots seized a British ship loaded with gunpowder and munitions, supplies that would soon find their way to the Continental Army. By that summer, the tide had shifted. Georgia sent Lyman Hall, Button Gwinnett, and George Walton to the Second Continental Congress, where they signed the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776. It was a decisive break with Britain, and a remarkable turn for a colony that had once been the king's most loyal outpost. The war that followed was brutal for Georgia. British forces captured Savannah in 1778, holding it for the remainder of the conflict. The Siege of Savannah in 1779, one of the bloodiest battles of the war, ended in defeat for the combined American and French forces. Many Georgians who had sided with the Patriots were forced into exile, their homes and livelihoods destroyed. Others, still loyal to the crown, fought alongside British troops, deepening the divide between neighbors and even families. Loyalty, once a point of pride, had become a dangerous gamble. For those who sided with the revolution, it meant risking everything for an uncertain future. For those who clung to Britain, it meant betting on an empire that might not win. In the end, Georgia, like the other colonies, emerged from the war battered but independent. The cost of that independence was steep: towns in ruins, trade disrupted, and deep scars left on its people. Yet, with Britain's rule gone, Georgia stood at the threshold of something entirely new. The questions that now loomed were no longer about loyalty to a distant king, but about identity, governance, and the shape of its own destiny. And so, from the ashes of war, Georgia began its transformation, from a royal colony bound to a monarch across the sea, to a sovereign state with the power to forge its own path. From colony to state, the revolution had ended, and with it, more than 4 decades of Georgia's life as a royal colony. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 confirmed the United States' independence, and Georgia found itself stepping into a new and uncertain role, not as a protectorate of the British Crown, but as a free member of a fledgling nation. It was a transformation that went far beyond changing flags. The colony that had once been bound by the authority of King George II now had to define itself through its own laws, leadership, and vision for the future. Georgia's leaders quickly began the work of building a state government, drafting a constitution in 1777 that declared the people, not a monarch, were the true source of political power. This was a radical shift for a place that had once prided itself on loyalty to a king. But self-rule came with challenges. Georgia was still recovering from the devastation of the war. Savannah had been burned, plantations destroyed, trade disrupted, and thousands displaced. The state also faced constant conflict on its western and southern borders, as tensions with Native American nations and Spanish Florida continued to shape its security and diplomacy. Despite these obstacles, Georgia pressed forward. In 1788, it became the 4th state to ratify the United States Constitution, cementing its place in the new republic. Its leaders embraced the promise of unity with the other former colonies, even as they worked to protect Georgia's unique interests and opportunities in the South. The state's capital shifted several times in the early years, from Savannah to Augusta and later to Louisville, reflecting the growth and movement of its population inland. Expansion was a constant priority. Georgia's leaders saw the vast lands to the west as both an opportunity for prosperity and a source of power in the new nation. Economically, Georgia transitioned quickly from the modest, self-reliant model envisioned by Oglethorpe to the plantation system that dominated much of the South. Cotton became king, and with it came a deepening reliance on enslaved labor. The ideals of equality and moral purpose that had marked the colony's founding gave way to an economic structure built on exploitation, a contradiction that would shadow Georgia's story for generations. Yet even as Georgia embraced its new identity as a state, it did not erase its past. The name, Georgia, remained, a lasting tribute to the monarch whose rule had once defined it. The streets of Savannah still echoed with the colonial architecture and city plan laid out in the earliest days. The stories of Oglethorpe, Tomochichi, and the first settlers were woven into the fabric of its identity. This blending of past and present was no accident. Georgia's journey from colony to state was not about abandoning its history, but about reshaping it. It stood as a place that carried the memory of British rule even as it forged its place in the American experiment. And in this balance, between old allegiances and new freedoms, Georgia became something rare, a living bridge between two worlds. A bridge between worlds. Georgia's identity was never defined by erasing the past, it was defined by carrying it forward. In its streets, one could still feel the weight of the colonial era, the grid-patterned squares of Savannah, the tabby walls of old forts, and the echoes of a time when loyalty to a distant king shaped every decision. Yet alongside these remnants of British rule stood the spirit of a young American state, proud of its independence and determined to chart its own future. In many ways, Georgia became a cultural meeting point between the old world and the new. Its name itself was a link to Britain's royal heritage, while its government and freedoms reflected the ideals of the American Revolution. This duality gave the state a unique place in the nation's story, able to honor its colonial roots without being bound by them. Trade and architecture bore the mark of Europe, but the land was worked and governed in the distinctly American fashion of self-determination. British traditions in law, commerce, and urban design blended with the agricultural enterprise and political independence of the new republic. Georgia did not simply sever one identity to take on another, it layered them, creating something richer and more complex. This blending was not without tension. The memory of the Revolution, the scars of war, and the expansion of the plantation system shaped debates over who truly belonged in Georgia's future. But the state's ability to merge its royal heritage with its republican reality gave it a symbolic strength. It could stand as a reminder that history need not be discarded to move forward. Generations after independence, visitors could still walk under the same oaks that shaded Oglethorpe and Tomochichi, still cross the cobblestones that felt the boots of British soldiers and Continental troops alike. The past was never far away, it was embedded in the soil, the names, and the very identity of the state. And so Georgia's story, at this point in its history, was not one of division but of connection. It was a living bridge, spanning two worlds, two systems, two identities, proof that a place could be both a product of its past and a shaper of its own destiny. That bridge, however, carried more than history. It carried pride. A pride deeply rooted in the South, yet touched by the elegance and legacy of royalty. Georgia's name is more than a label on a map, it is a crown set deep in southern soil. Long after the cannons fell silent and the king's banner was lowered, the state carried forward the dignity and weight of its royal namesake. In its architecture, its traditions, and even its genteel southern charm, there lingers a quiet echo of the courtly grace once reserved for monarchs. But here, that royalty is not locked away in palaces. It lives in the public squares of Savannah, in the grand domes of its capitals, in the pride of its people. The legacy of King George II may have begun as a distant political tribute, but in Georgia it became something more personal. A thread woven into identity, a reminder that history can leave its mark not as a chain, but as an heirloom. In the heart of the South, Georgia stands as both a product of its royal birth and a testament to its own making, where the crown's shadow has not dimmed the light of independence, but instead adds a rare glint to its story.